Let's talk a little bit about some of the game design mechanics that Clark, that you particularly like. Obviously, the graphics are rich. There's a number of levels going on here. Do you want to talk about some of your favorite game design elements they're using?
Sure, and I and I will say one thing, mildly negative, and not certainly not overly, but in my mind, it's a tiny bit more cartoony than I would like it, and not really this one, but some of the other Acton simulations are, in my opinion, a little cartoony. And again, it's not a problem, and it was done incredibly deliberately in order to try to engage more people. I found some people didn't necessarily give it the respect it was due initially, and they had to get sort of past the cartoony stuff. But I tends to be a little more, just a slightly more realistic in terms of like a New Yorker cartoon or something. And again, the level of Robo Rush is pretty perfect. I think some of the other ones are a little cartoony for my taste.
Yeah, I think.
But that's,
Yeah, I think that you can tell from their latest, the one on pricing, the game on pricing, where they're seeming to go to a little more of a less cartoony, or the design or some of the graphics are a little more professional or business-like, I guess, as compared to cartoon.
I mean, there's always a sort of line you walk between feeling engaging and then being taken seriously, because these very large, iconic, you've got very distinct, obvious shapes and colors and really easy to read facial expressions do have a lot of value for education, because there's not a lot of data overload. It's really easy to tell what's going on. But games in general do have a problem with being taken seriously. Even though the majority of people that play games now are in their 20s or 30s, they're still seen as something for kids, and that's still a stigma that you have to work with when you're designing games.
Yeah, and that's the other thing about the Acton situation is that I actually think these graphics are very appropriate for the Acton situation, where there's a terrific respectability around the brand that already exists, not like Harvard or Wharton. Acton has a really great track record, so that's a very so they don't have to worry about it as much as perhaps the rest of us do. The other thing is that if you're an Acton student, you're there, you're committed to a very rigorous, challenging environment, and so again, this is probably absolutely perfect. But when looking at deploying simulations outside of that very refined environment, then I think, certainly from my perspective, I have to worry a little more about the credibility that people have as they walk by and they see it and they think this is indeed a worthwhile activity, as opposed to something that is a little more trivial.
So we've got the levels of the early garage building, and then we've got the storefront and the factory. So those are our levels. So.
Yeah, and it's very nice, because each level is very understandable, and each level is it's pretty easy to understand what's going on in each of the three levels. You're not facing information overload. The mechanics are fairly simple. In some cases, there may be a few of it's a very rich interface, and sort of the nice thing is that you can kind of ignore the parts of the interface you don't quite understand. And this is one of the situations where perhaps a classroom, might augment but not necessarily be necessary for the successful use of this type of simulation, because there's a bunch of those little lines there as you went to that screen. The yellow lines, for example, we're not quite sure what they do or what they mean. And again, if you had an instructor walking through it, you start shining light on all these things. You don't need to know that stuff, but it tends to make it a little richer. So I think that's really good. So the level design is very crisp, very clear. Unlike most simulations, which have level design based on more and more complexity and more stuff happening and harder, which is sort of the typical Space Invaders on-up level design of most serious games. These are three very different levels. There's the same philosophy, obviously the same products that tie the three together, but it is not, it's not the same game but harder, or the same game with more bad guys or less resources or whatever. Each of the different levels are very deliberately very different experiences, and that's neither good nor bad compared to the other way of doing it. It's just it's an interesting, in this case, very successful design decision.
Yeah, it seems like it would be. It's more expensive to build several. It's always more expensive to build lots of mini games versus one large game, because you have to build several different core engines that way. But they seem to have handled it in a good way here.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's worth noting. I mean, what's nice about one other thing I like about the sort of Acton Business School as a role model is these games are all they're all flash based, which I think is a really good model moving forward, at least for the foreseeable future. They're completely downloadable via a browser, which is nice. Again, unlike something like America's Army, which is a big downloadable, or Second Life, which is a big downloadable piece of content. And also, again, the production values are really nice, and I think anyone who looks at this stuff in the context of serious games and simulations can really appreciate, on one hand, there's completely sufficient production values. They're really nice, they look good, they feel good, they're very interactive, they have nice back and forth, but they're not these giant, they're not break the bank. You don't look at this and say, oh, I could never afford this. And you look at what Acton has done, and you look at almost any organization, and this kind of activity, if you have more than 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, whatever employees, this kind of activity is incredibly financially accessible. And so that's another really nice thing. These things are good role models because I think they don't provide a breaking the bank. We all love, Halo 3, and we all love very large, complex AAA computer games, and The Sims 3 now, and even SimCity and whatever. And I think a lot of people, when talking about educational simulations, start talking about World of Warcraft, and let's do a World of Warcraft type of experience. And I think the sanity and the scale and the scope and the focus of all these Acton Business School products are really refreshing because to me they're the right level. They're neither too simple nor too complex to be very sustainable.
Right, and this game actually, as I play it, really reminds me of several commercially successful casual games that are out there on the web. There's one about making pizza, which is actually very similar to this, where you get your customer orders and you build the pizza using a little flash interface, just like the wiring diagram, and then sell it and try to make continuous profit. And that game may or may not be educational, whether or not it follows closely this sort of business, knowledge that or skills that are being taught here. But to me, showing that game is commercially successful shows that game can be, it's engaging without necessarily. People don't care if it's educational or not, and it's interesting to see this game. I don't know if it was intentionally following that model or not, but.
So where do you think, Clark? Where do you think Acton's going with this, as far as the financial investment and in terms of getting a payoff for their investment?
Well, I think a lot of the motivation of Acton is to role model a better way of doing things. So there's at least two different success models for them, and one model is, again, if they truly do provide a better education, they will attract more students, and there's the factory built at the end there. So I think one part is to attract more students. I think part of their long-range growth is to go more virtual, and so to provide an Acton Business School education for people who aren't necessarily going to Austin, Texas. And I think one thing that we've learned is that a lot of, and don't go past this slide for 1 second, if you will. One thing we really have learned is that if you're going to do any kind of distance education, any kind of virtual education, then having some kind of, and indeed multiple simulations is a very important part of success. So I think it's, a lot of the early business school, a lot of the early anything schools, early virtual universities that have not included this kind of simulation, again, have not been able to engage the students. This is a nice chart at the end. This is sort of ultimately the end of the program, where you get to see the sort of the X-ray vision and supervision of what the market really does look like, and ultimately where you committed to doing it in terms of both profit and popularity. So ultimately, your goal is to make something that is both very profitable and very popular. You might do one or the other, and certainly, as I think you did in the situation, you kind of didn't do either. So
no. I built the cheapest.
It always speaks well for the game when you act relatively randomly and you end up not doing very well. So that speaks well too.
Right.
There's nothing worse than accidental success in a simulation. Unfortunately, it's probably the only thing worse than accidental simulation in a simulation is having a boss who's been accidentally successful in a corporation.
Right.
That's a whole different issue.
That does happen too. These accidental successful people. Unfortunately, there's plenty around. Well. Clark, appreciate your time today. This is an interesting review of what Acton is doing down in Austin, Texas, and we appreciate your time today.